everyone to this virtual land that we are going to share with each other for the next hour and a half. I have the pleasure of introducing my fellow natural building teammate, Tim Kennedy, as well as briefly saying a couple of words about the Village Building Convergence, which this evening's conversation is a part of. So as you all can see, we are not in physical space with each other, and all of the programming that usually takes place as part of the Village Building Convergence pretty quickly transformed into becoming an online offering. And this evening conversation is one of those. This is the 10th night of 10 nights of the VBC. The co-executive director of the City Repair Project, who is a big part of putting on this annual festival, is going to share some links with all of you into the chat room for you to see a couple more of the final offerings besides this evening's conversation for the VBC if you're interested in those. Otherwise, this evening's conversation is how our natural building team responded to the challenges of seeing what we could offer in the midst of the coronavirus. And it's really dear to our hearts, and we've been working really hard on bringing you a really valuable and worthy conversation this evening. My dear friend and collaborator, Tim Kennedy, is here with me. We're representing the natural building team. And to briefly introduce Tim, for those of you who don't know him, he is a natural builder with over 25 years of experience, I would say. He's one of the co-founders of Vital Systems, and I would say that one of the things I appreciate about Tim as a natural builder is that the ways he engages as a contractor or a natural builder in more conventional terms, I understand is secretly a camouflage for him being a social sculptor, a community sculptor, a cultural sculptor. And that's very much part of what he's bringing to tonight's conversation. So please, everyone, help me welcome Tim Kennedy.
Thank you, Francis, and thank you everyone for joining. We are going to try and keep the video function off for the initial part of this conversation and have presentations from the main presenters. Then we'll move on to more video sharing and more conversation and chat where we can each share our videos. So if you can keep your videos off, it'll keep the screen clean. And our Francis here with the shiny lights, practicing some great resilience in joining us from the coast in her car. Just wonderful. And that's a big piece of what I want to say about Francis as a great storyteller and a committed person to this village building and culture building. A natural builder engaged with the Village Building Convergence for over 10 years, really always crafting the quality of space between people, the space that holds people, the space that can serve to make a better world. I think that's always what she's aiming for. So thank you, Francis, for joining us. And then Francis, I want to also introduce Massey, who I will try and get to join us here visually. Massey Burke is in the Bay Area of California and co-director of the California Straw Building Association. She first took on natural building at Emerald Earth with Michael Smith and Daryl Berlin, and immediately just propagated with her just boisterous spirit natural building into the world at large around her. I remember I drove along the Clear Lake quite a bit in those days, and all of a sudden there was a bunch of natural building popping up in public spaces, and really high quality natural building, which is not what I was used to seeing in public spaces in Mendocino and Lake counties. And then I finally heard that it was Massey that was doing that, and it made a lot more sense.
Mm.
She's gone on to move to the Bay Area to really look at the integration of natural building in the urban environment, and that has led her to unfold the culture of supply chain, regenerative supply chain building, and how we can scale natural building in a way that community building happens throughout. So welcome, Massey. And Francis, will you introduce Molly?
I'd be honored to introduce another of our panelists named Molly Murphy. I had the pleasure of working with Molly Murphy as she came down with a couple of other mud girls from Canada. Molly is incredible. Molly is an incredible teacher, and I would count her as one of my teachers of natural building. She is also one of the co-founders of the Mud Girls up on Salt Spring Island in Canada. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Mud Girls, it's a collective of natural builders who focus on prioritizing families and women, and absolutely wholeheartedly is, I would argue, one of the greatest examples of an alternative approach to offering livelihood and building practices, specifically natural building practices, that I've ever encountered, and we're really lucky to have her here with us today. Thanks for being here, Molly.
Great to see you, Molly.
Thank you, Francis. Thank you, Timothy.
Mm-hmm.
And then I will invite Chris in, if you can drop your video, Francis. See if I can do that. So Chris Magwood is known to many of you as the kind of most vocal and prolific engager with the rest of culture at large, up out of Canada, near Toronto, at the Endeavour Center. And he's published 7 books engaging with natural building, and has really done a great job in kind of thoroughly investigating what it takes to keep growing this process and this possibility, as we look at what natural building has to offer the rest of the world. Much more extensive bios are available on the event page if anyone wants to see more of that. But I just want to welcome Chris and thank you for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure. Looking forward to it. Great.
So when we started the idea for this panel, it looked like, we were really going to have to dig in as a culture and figure out what resilience looked like and what it meant to reorient how we were. And then we got another wake up to even a deeper way to reassess the challenges that our culture as it's been built. Just doesn't work well for anyone. I would say that pretty universally, and it's just been brought more and more clearly to light. So Frances asked if she could help contextualize us for this conversation, and I'd like to turn it over to her.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, it's true. So as a natural building team, we brought our heads together to think of what sort of combination of natural builders we would hope to call on to help us address this question of what role does natural building play in building a resilient future. And I would argue that the group of panelists we've gathered are well suited to the task, and not only have heartfulness and a rebelliousness and a wildness that they have brought to their life's work, but they also have a really wide spectrum of how they focused in their pursuit of natural building. And when we first had the impetus for this conversation, and when we first contacted the 3 of them and shared with them the sort of the shape and the confines of the conversation we were hoping to have, it was in the midst of the coronavirus, and it was before the riots in Minneapolis had begun and before George Floyd's murder. And I think we can all say here in this moment that there is clarity in a newer, even more profound and overwhelming way, that any conversation we are having around the future, building a future and creating a resilient future, needs to have the transformation of systems of oppression at the forefront of its efforts. And because of the rebelliousness and heartfulness of the life's work of the three panelists, there are absolutely those themes in what they will offer this evening, even though that's not what we specifically asked them to focus on. I think it is present here in their words and in their images. And as a natural builder and a mother and a person on this planet, I am looking forward to, in this moment, planting a seed for future conversations where that focus and intent and consciousness around all of the tools we're using for future building, having that focus and that priority of looking at how is it addressing this challenge of transforming systems of oppression. And I think it wouldn't be difficult to convince everyone in this virtual space with us that natural building is a really powerful and potent tool for doing that. And I invite myself and I invite all of us to consider the responsibility that comes with that power. So without further ado, I would like to pass the mic to my friend and collaborator, Molly Murphy, as she shares with us her understanding, worthy experience of addressing this challenge of creating resilient futures through the tool and art of natural building.
Thank you. Thank you, Frances. So first thing I want to say is that my heart's beating like 1,000 beats a minute. There are a lot of you watching, and that's unusual for me not to actually be with the people I'm talking to. This is a brand new thing that I've never done before. So yeah, that's all I've got to say about that. And the world is going through a major transition right now. And sometimes part of my mind has not exactly been on natural building, as there's so many other things that seem, as much as everything we're going to talk about ties into the complexities and the challenges the entire world faces, there's a lot of other very deep rooted issues in humanity that need to be worked on. But which is why I think what we're talking about when we talk about resilience, it is the capacity to recover quickly and well from difficulties. So in my mind, it's about the flexibility to move through things. And I think when something is rigid, you're not able to experience what other people might be experiencing. And I think that's what we're all realizing, is that there are experiences in the world that we're not experiencing. Some people are experiencing them and some people aren't. And it's up to the people that aren't to realize that they need to step up and make the world a better place. And I believe that true long-term resilience can only come based on the quality of the relationships that you have. So your relationships to people and your relationships to the world that we live in, because we only look after what we care about. So if we care about the planet, we're going to make better decisions in relation to how we treat it and what materials we use for doing the things that we want to do. And we all know that the drive to build naturally is based on a care for our environment and a care for ourselves. And using local and natural materials to create your home makes a lower impact on the environment. And by doing that, you're kind of showing the world that you care for it. The materials that you're using are coming from a local source. So the closer the materials are to the place in which you're building, the less carbon, the less energy that is used to create your home. And then the manufacturing of your materials on site instead of in some far off place also reduces the impact that the building of the house has on the environment, and also creates an amazing connection to each and every post. If you've got to cut and peel each and every post, you're going to have a connection to that post as it goes into place, as it rises up, as it gets its notches and gets its fasteners. You have a connection to it compared to just like, 300 2x4s that you picked up at the shop, right? So, so the next thing, well, the most important thing when it comes to resilience, in my mind, more than anything, is people. So when you're in trouble, when you're having a hard time, having people that you can rely on to help you get through those hard times is what's going to get you through. It's what's going to make a difference and make you feel like you can survive the challenges, which is sort of what I'm referencing, the world that we're living in now. It's about having human connections. And one of the best ways to have a human connection is to create a human connection is by help. So in our workshops, we have, 16 people that mostly haven't met each other before, and they show up and they, on the first day, start helping each other by, help carrying a bucket, moving a tarp closer to the site, picking up a dish for a nursing mom. And after 5 or 10 days of helping, there's a relationship which is based on care. Because the moment somebody helps you, even if you don't know them, you're like, oh, there's a decent person. They're here to help me, and that means I like them. And so I think natural building leads itself well to that, because you can't do it alone. You have to have a whole bunch of people, and you have to work together. And I think that's one of the paramount aspects of what we're doing. Sorry about my ums. So what else do I want to say? So when you're there together and you're building things, you're working towards a common goal, and the building stays in one place, but the relationships move on into the future. So you've spent some time creating bonds and relationships over the course of 5 or 10 days or however long the workshop is. And when the workshop is over, there's not this sense of relief, like, oh, good, I get to go back to my regular life. There's a feeling of almost grief as you realize that you have to go back to whatever your life was, whether it was, back to university or back to the urban environment. And I think there's something in that when you realize that you've just been doing this thing that filled your heart and your mind and your body with so much, that there's something, what we want people to do is to take that mentality of care and help and bring it into their world. There's like a fire that gets lit inside their bellies, and we want people to be able to take that fire with them and the relationships that they build on the work site. So, these people, they work together, that middle picture there, I set them up to build a rough opening for a window, and I showed them how to do it and how to square it up, but I left them to it. I didn't intervene. They had to show me when they were finished. And I'd look over once in a while, see how they're doing, like sneaky looks, like not checking to see if they're doing it right, just seeing how they're doing. And I'm just watching these two people that hadn't met 2 days ago, like helping each other and figuring it out and standing there with their hands on their hips being like, oh geez, I don't know what I'm gonna do. And then, this is the moment where they're like, dude, high five, we just built a box, And I think that's an amazing way to create resilience in the long run, because they're able to have that relationship and that bond over creating something together. Yeah, so also one of the biggest parts of what the Mud Girls do is we include childcare in all of our workshops and all of our crew jobs as well. So each and every workshop has a dedicated paid Mud Girl or some person we really know really well, looking after the children. And what this does is this gives access to a whole demographic of people that generally weren't super encouraged to come to things like permaculture design courses or natural building courses, because there usually wasn't an available childcare. And usually what would happen is a couple would go and then the parents would have to take turns looking after their kids. But what this does is it frees up single parents, especially, to be able to continue their learning and continue living their dreams. And it's not a permanent culture without the kids. Like, we're not going to go anywhere forward in the future if we're not including children, and if we're not including young mothers, not young mothers, mothers of young children into our workshop scenarios. And of course the kids bring, one of the cool things too is that sometimes if there's a lot of kids, the participants take turns kind of subbing in and helping with the childcare. So there's relationships of all the different demographics. So we have someone who's like of a grandfather age, but maybe doesn't have grandchildren, and he spends, a morning with the kids. And then we have like a 22-year-old hippie dude who spends the morning with the kids. And there's these relationships that these kids get to experience, all these different types of relationships that they wouldn't normally get. Plus they get to see that their parent is out there doing something that makes their heart happy. And I think the key to having happy kids is having happy parents. At least that's my perspective on parenting, is that if I'm miserable, I mean, everybody's miserable. So being able to take my kids to work with me has been revolutionary in my ability to sort of feel like I'm still a human being and feel like I have more going on than just being a mom. Because that can be really challenging as a woman who's got who has ideas. And when you have kids, sometimes your ideas just kind of can't formulate into anything because you're too busy keeping up. So I really, really, really value that aspect of the Mud Girls. I wouldn't be part of the Mud Girls if it wasn't for my son was 6 months old and he's 14 now. So I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that opportunity to do it with my boy. So yeah, and I was able to have more children and keep working, and that's really, really important to me. And the other really cool aspect of the Mud Girls, of course, is that we're an all women's, non-hierarchical, consensus-based building collective. And one of the reasons we did that was because we didn't really know what we were doing so much when we started. And we wanted a really safe place to be able to figure that out without having someone mansplain all the details. It's not like we wanted to reinvent the wheel, but we wanted to be able to have a safe place to figure things out on our own and have a dynamic that was equal, because we all know in our society there, despite even the best intentioned man, if there is one in the room, the authority gets deferred to them, even if it's not him taking the authority. If a new person walks in the room, the authority can be deferred to the man. And that is kind of what we were trying to not have happen. We wanted to have there be no way to decide who's in charge when you walk into one of our building sites, or there's no obvious person in charge based on gender. So yeah, that was the main reason. And of course, working together with a bunch of women is a lot of fun. We like resilience. I mean, if it's not going to be fun, no one's sticking around, right? It's got to be a good time. And we laugh all the time. We have, our workshops are pretty much big goof fests while we work really hard in the day and goof off in the evening. We have talent shows or passion shows that are just really silly expressions of our best selves, of our silliest selves, or heartfelt beat poetry. It all happens, right? And I think that's probably the most important thing, that if you're going to do something in the long term, you have to really, really want to. And you're not going to really, really want to if it's painful or full of stress or chaos. Well, chaos is okay. A little bit of chaos is kind of fun because usually you figure it out in the long run. It creates challenges, but you have to be able to laugh when things go awry. And I think we do that really, really well. Yeah, that's there it is again. There's that's my house. That's 10 years ago, 11 years ago. So yeah, I want to just say that when it comes to natural building, And when it comes to resilience, I think they go hand in hand, because you can't, like, you know, there are lots of different ways to be doing natural building, of course, and some natural buildings can have a lot of higher embodied energy than others. But what's inherent no matter what usually is that there's a community aspect and a sense of connection to the materials, which I think is really, really precious. So thank you.
Thank you, Molly. That was really wonderful and takes me back to the roots for sure. That's one of my favorite things about natural building, having come out of conventional building. Once I really got a sense for the way that it propagated more value for gender balance and a lot less trying harder to do it, you know, to tackle the problem, use a bigger hammer. That technique really changed. So just wanted to kind of maybe stop the screen sharing now and have a little bit of conversation about that and how each of us kind of came through that process, and then how that quality of community that natural building cultivates, how do we extend that beyond the project, beyond the site, to the culture at large, and how have you all worked with that in your own lives and or witnessed that in the project as it goes after it's built as well?
I think one of the things that I've seen as a result of the connections that happen through natural building is, of course, the drive to create. So the participants drive to create something themselves, you know, whether it's an oven or a whole house, and how there is then this pool of human resources that these participants who choose to build can then, because everyone, when they leave, going, okay, yeah, I'll come to Nelson. Okay, yeah, I'll go to wherever. I'll go wherever you are, and I'll join you and help you. So I think that's something that can happen as a result of the connections that happen. Like, to take that, what happens at a workshop, and move it forward into the future. It almost like creates this like pool of willing and eager laborers.
How about you, Massey or Chris? Any experiences with that?
Yeah, it's been kind of following what Molly is saying, is the number of connections that get made. You know, I've been sort of teaching, the program that we do is longer than a workshop. It's, you know, 4 to 6 months long. And so you've got, you know, about a dozen people who spend half a year together in that scenario. And I feel like a lot of the things that Molly just talked about it's sort of true wherever it happens, that we have a lot of fun. There's a lot of silliness. There's a lot of really hard work. There's a lot of, you know, seeing the best in people. There's, you know, a lot of good moments of seeing the worst in people. But, you know, regardless of whether people who've worked with us go on to ever build anything again or go on to build everything, and that's what they do for the rest of their lives, the number of connections that get made. And, you know, with our program, we also try to gather people, you know, from year to year too. So there's this incredible network of, you know, people who've done this thing together, who meet the other people who've done this thing together, who end up working together, who end up, you know, sharing their contacts and connections. You know, it's a pretty, it's one of those moments where you can really sort of see how those webs get built. You know, if I look at those workshop and course lists of names, and if I were to plot them on a map, that would just be this crazy, you know, mixing, including, you know, there's at least 8 married couples now and 8 or 9 children in the world who, you know, are a result of meeting at these things. And so it's, yeah, and it does go way beyond the building part. You know, a lot of those people don't ever build anything ever again, but they built something human connection wise that lasts a really, really long time.
Yeah, I think for me, it's just it's interesting because I'm realizing, especially these days, how much more, well, also am somewhat more engaged with the conventional way that buildings get made, and also just doing a lot of thinking and research work around buildings. I'm realizing how much of that element is actually not immediately present in my life, which is interesting. Molly, it was, I mean, I don't know, a bunch of things came to mind. I guess maybe speaking more directly to your question, Tim, it's one thing that I've always loved about teaching hands-on, either in a workshop, which is mostly what I've done, you know, from short to a week long, and then earlier in my building career, I helped teach some apprenticeships. Is that it frequently doesn't take more than saying, you can build that, for someone to be like, oh, I can build that. And also, I think it was really nice to see your building group, Molly, and it made me both kind of wish I had started that way, and for some reason my entire building life has been me and a bunch of dudes. But I also think and I like that too, actually. There's something that's really that typically isn't so, I don't find that too taxing most of the time. But I also think I end up in the role a lot, I think, of helping make space in that context for voices that are quieter, for better, for worse. Sometimes I feel like I do that better than in other contexts, but it does seem to keep coming up in my life. For just what that community of voices feels like, really edging its way into the sort of more conventional way that we think about buildings and the built environment and what the built environment is for.
Beautiful. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, that's this ongoing piece over and over again, is just to watch the reverberations from the quality of working really hard together and achieving small, steady progress and care for materials that otherwise make good compost. I think there's something also about that the fragility of the material conceptually feels to me like it leads to more openness and care for the material. And I think that's also one of the reasons that natural building benefits so specifically from having gender balance, to really shift. It does seem to help shift consciousness on sites the more I've experienced it. Well, we can return to this conversation for a good long time, but maybe we can move on to what Massey brought to share. And thanks again so much, Molly. That was deeply heartening.
Thank you, Molly.
Thank you.
So this is also, Molly, it was wonderful to see all of your work, which I don't know very well. And it made me realize, man, my life has gotten rectilinear. This is, case in point. So I got really, well, actually, to back up, even just listening to how Molly gave her presentation has kind of changed how I want to say a few things. I want to pick up on the thread that resilience is relationship. And I feel like most of my work has really there's been a lot of wonderful human relationship and enabling and many other things. But I really feel like probably my focus, whether or not I am always aware of it, is the relationship between humanity and the biosphere. And how the built environment is one of our most powerful tools for I used to say reimagining, but these days it's more, I feel like it's more relearning and renewing what humanity's right relationship is with the rest of the living world. And what's so interesting about the built environment is that it's just human habitat, and so we don't, like, everything makes habitat. Trees make habitat, so we experience the habitat making of other living things as nature. And there's no real law that says human habitat can't be more of a part of that. And of course, being Tim, I had no idea that your first experience of my building work were those funny structures along Highway 20. But the reason I said that is that it's, I guess if it's accurate that I'm somewhat boisterous, of course, then I decided that I wanted to address the part of our culture that seems the least connected to the biosphere with building. And so I got pretty interested in what it looked like to bring natural building into the urban fabric, which when I began to learn how to build, pretty much wasn't happening, at least that I knew of. That was probably a few years in. I mean, I did my building apprenticeship with Michael and Daryl, and then pretty quickly started teaching and building, stuff in remote places, as most of us have at least begun, and I still feel is the wellspring of what this whole movement is about in a lot of ways. But I just, you start teaching and you watch people dig clay out of the ground and turn around and produce a building, and you can watch a whole narrative getting unmade and rebuilt. And I figured out pretty quickly that it's also useful to help midwife the birth of that narrative. And the narrative really is, I think, that humans don't have to be destructive necessarily. Like, part of our birthright is to contribute to the biosphere, but part of our responsibility is to know how to do that. And so I feel like I watch people, it's sort of the sort of cave in the dark myth, I call it. It's like you have this idea that to be in harmony with the biosphere, you have to live in a cave in the dark and be cold and hungry all the time. So when you make a building out of mud, it just begins to retell that story. But I would watch people often end up in like what I call the Hobbit house cul-de-sac. And believe me, I love Tolkien. I love Hobbit houses, like totally great. But I often found that people would have this opening experience and then they'd be like, oh, it's a Hobbit house, which I contest is a way of relegating that to an imaginary world without being aware of it. And so I think I've been obsessed for a long time with, humanity biosphere relationships, and also the narratives that help people's imaginations stay open about that and its reality. Tim, do you want to? Oh, actually, don't go yet. Back up. So this is my house. It's in the Bay Area, close to Berkeley. And it's a light straw clay remodel with local site clay of a really funky stick frame with stucco built in the 40s. And we did this, as you're probably aware now, there's a light straw clay is in the International Residential Code, but at that time it was an alternative means and methods permit application. So early on I got interested in permitting stuff that hadn't been permitted, at least in certain areas, and using those tools as, it's a translation exercise really. And now a lot of people do it. It's not so uncommon anymore, but taking vernacular experience and translating it into the language of the building department, which turned out to be really valuable. I've only done it a few times personally, and then have been, partially involved in other projects. But I found myself loving that translation exercise too, and that is part of, I think, really infiltrating the urban fabric. Okay. For people who maybe aren't familiar with what it might look like to apply, so I'm going to talk a little bit about just natural remodeling, which has become part of has become kind of my physical focus in terms of natural building. So here's just a bunch of surfaces that are earthen, but in conventional buildings. These are mostly earthen floors and plasters. So yeah, the bottom left corner is an earthen floor poured onto an old wood floor in a remodel in Berkeley. The other two earthen floors are, I think, on gypcrete, and then I think the one at the bottom is just more normal, like a slab. And then, clay paints, natural plasters on conventional surfaces. And then some more recent investigations. This is something that actually I don't think it's Chris's focus, but I keep meaning to ask Chris to tell me what the carbon footprint of sheetrock is, because I keep meaning to compare it to systems like this, where you can replace sheetrock in a conventional building with clay, lath, and plaster, or other techniques. And so this is the most recent. We did a really funny, the exterior is a straw bale wrap, which is the next photo. But in the interior, there was this really funny piecemeal situation where they had to tear off a bunch of sheetrock and replace it with plywood shear panels in some places, and then just leave it open in other places to get to the wiring. And so we did all these different applications. It's a pretty unusual client, of plaster for those different surfaces, and then some clay paint. And so it was some clay, lath, and plaster in place of sheetrock, some plaster on plywood, clay plaster on plywood, and some clay paint on existing sheetrock. This is the exterior, so this is fun. This is a project we finished up last fall, and we wrapped a whole building. This is around the corner from my house, actually. We wrapped the whole building in bales. And I think in this case, again, I feel this is as good a narrative project as anything, because there probably would have been easier ways to insulate this building, though it wasn't a bad candidate for a bale wrap. But one thing that's, and you can't, this photo is not great for this, but one reason that it really worked well aesthetically, I think, and that is, again, a clay plaster from the site, is that you can see the door on the right. This house is part of an eco-village that's forming near my house. And this is going to be a family house now, but it's also a little bit of a common house. And so they made all of the bedrooms with their own private outdoor access. And so the bales really give you this wonderful sort of indoor-outdoor transitional feel for all of those personal spaces. And I think increases the flexibility, as well as the building's relationship to, like, indoor-outdoor relationship. Being in California, we spend a lot of our time outdoors. Tim, did you want to talk a bit about remodeling there before I keep going, or just keep going?
Sorry, trying to unmute had me advancing the slides. Oh. Yeah, I think the reason for natural remodeling, I think, is something that I think would be fun for us to discuss, and how much of the built environment for the long-term resilience and moving into an urban environment seems essential to really bring the qualitative space, the qualitative sense of space that natural building materials bring to all of our lives to as many people as possible. And most people live in existing structures or even own existing structures to remodel. And so really was grateful that you could highlight that. I wondered if anyone else wanted to say any more about that process, or for them, or their thoughts about integrating natural materials into an existing structures and urban context.
Maybe just to say, yeah, everybody should do it. It's really, in some ways, there's when you do a house from scratch, it's such a massive undertaking. It can be overwhelming, and the path to being able to do that is pretty limiting in terms of the number of people who can afford it, the number of people who have the land that they could do it on, even the sort of permitting hoops that you have to go through. But if you can find some clay and some water and a paintbrush, you can make a start on doing these things. And I think it's a really amazing pathway to be able to do that, and maybe gets around a bit of what Massey was talking about, which I think I've experienced a lot too, is people's experiences of whatever full-on kind of natural buildings are these often remote, off-grid, whimsical places out in the country, and then a bunch of urban people come and help at the workshop and then go home, and it's like what how do I put these two things together? And I think the way you put them together is paint a room, replace a floor, fix the things you have using that stuff. And I think it's such an easy step to be able to take, one room at a time, one wall at a time, one floor at a time, whatever it happens to be. And it's a great way to kind of, learn in a controlled way, and also, bring these notions that people, I think, feel like don't belong in an urban context into that place.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that a little bit, I think we also need more resources and technical support for people who want to do that. And that's actually something this panel is not meant to be like, a more general conversation, but I am going to try to get through to create through CASBA some more specific resources for natural remodeling as opposed to new construction. And I also think we have a lot more innovation because integrating natural materials with existing buildings depends a lot on the building type in the area and your climate and the moisture behavior in that climate and those materials. And so it can be a little more complicated too. So I feel like there's work to do there to help that become more widespread.
And Francis, that's been a lot of your work in Portland, right? A lot of retrofit and natural building materials. And community building in that urban environment, I think, is really absolutely essential. I think that's one of the reasons we end up with such a big divide between urban and rural experiences in America, especially, is because it takes different things to support human community in those two environments. So,
it takes different what, Tim?
Different things, different approaches, different cultural needs, different experiences.
Mm-hmm. It's true. And I live in a house in Portland, Oregon that I think I would say offered itself as sort of a test subject for a lot of these retrofitting approaches. So before light straw clay was legalized in Portland, Oregon, our house retrofitted our living room, kind of our main first floor using light straw clay, and then used, thoroughly documented it and used partly that process as a means for generating the information that helped it become legalized in Portland. And also from that home, we teach a permaculture design course. And so, annually have, probably around 100 people come through and gives us the opportunity to say, and this room you're standing in has been, retrofitted with light straw clay, and an opportunity to explain that process. We have, I think many of you know what a truth window is. So there's a small heart inside of our living room that shows the guts of our walls, the insulation of our walls. And I think a theme already I'm gathering from Molly's presentation and Massey yours is that moment of shifting the narrative, as you said, Massey, of just like shifting people's understanding of what's possible. And I've seen that absolutely take place in our home, which otherwise is conventional stick frame, turn of the century, old growth timber house of Portland, Oregon. So I've seen it give people permission to think it's something they can approach in their own lives with what home they have access to, and have seen it in that way be more affecting to more people. And I would also say, Massey, that you were joking that your structures are not as organic or round as some of the ones we saw in Molly's. And I think just a vote here for natural building getting to look like all sorts of different ways, for it to get to be round and sculptural, and for it to get to be linear and more conventional looking. And that I think that or a version of conventional looking. And I think that there's a part of that that's also doing the bridge work of helping to make natural building more accessible to more people visually, because I think some people might come at natural building from an ecological standpoint, but are really not interested in what we usually, ascribe of an aesthetic to it. So I think that's actually really important, that it gets to look like lots of different things, and that we create more and more examples of all the different different kinds of beautiful that natural building can be.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I like that. And I was just laughing at myself because it's been, I realized how much that has crept looking at all these presentations and looking at mine. But I agree with you.
Prep here in Eugene.
Oh, I know, right? Well, this isn't mine, so this is not,
But still, we do know some really organic, natural builders that were involved in this as well. So it's not.
Yes. So should I continue?
Oh yeah, I said let's go ahead.
All right. Yeah. So just a few notes on scaling up in terms of specific buildings. It's like, again, kind of a narrative thing. There's a funny unexamined mental habit in the conventional design world, and also maybe I guess you could say more mainstream culture, that something's only real if it can be vertical, in terms of building materials, and so even though most of the housing in the world is residential, there's something really powerful in our collective at least our Western psyche, if you can make a multiple story building out of it. Like that somehow brings it into a different category of, quote, reality or relevance. And while I certainly don't think that's the only useful pathway for innovating natural materials, it's interesting. And we are an urbanizing culture, though I feel like after the end of this year, I have no idea what cultural movement we'll be in. But we'll say at the beginning of 2020, we were an urbanizing world. And a lot of that urbanization is happening in places like China, where it's very relevant to figure out how to make lots of multi-stories out of something that isn't concrete. So it's fun to just talk about a couple images of how that's developing. And actually, I was hoping to get a sketch from something we're working on right now, David Arkin and I and another group here in the Bay Area. It's a concept, a fairly completely engineered concept design for a multi-story urban wood framed straw infill building for the East Bay. And so that image is not included here. But the Mahonia project that I was just, the previous slide, and it's here again in the corner, is the upper second and third stories are wood frame, straw insulation, interior clay plaster, designed by David Arkin's office, David and Annie. And you guys actually, I think, know the plaster team. Erica, I think Erica was the plaster. Yeah. And then just also thinking about what is the future of natural materials in the urban context. And it looks like a whole lot of different things. You probably are familiar with the type of building in the upper left slide, but that's an image from Burkina Faso. That is their urban environment, and it's continues. It's a living tradition, So I think part of natural building in urban spaces is continuing existing traditions. Part is, exploring new places to use fiber and in combinations with other, conventional materials like the metal siding on the Mahonia project. Part of it, as Francis mentioned, is exploration of shape. Like I just love the little building on the upper right. I've actually forgotten whose building that is. And then, as I mentioned, beginning to model, 6-story, 8-story buildings that take advantage of new types of engineered timber and can accept usually natural insulation, but we're also looking at what scaling up earthen floors would look like in a context like that. So this is what I've been thinking a lot about recently, and so this is sort of my cutting edge of how to forward natural building and also scale it up. And one of the things I will say that kind of bugs me along with the Hobbit House thing is a train of thought that says, well, natural building can't scale up, in some conventional sense, by which I think most people mean you can't make a whole pile of things that are identical all at once very easily. Which, one, is not entirely true. We just haven't been doing it. And two, I don't really think that's not what scaling up is. That's one form of scaling up. And so many years ago, I got thinking about, like, what does it mean to scale up, I would say the deeper intention of natural building, which for me goes back to human biosphere relationships. So I think the other thing that's so incredible about the one-to-one experiences that people have when you go out to a fairly remote place with a lot of space and time to experience the materials and the relationships and the building process, is that you get to have a pretty direct experience of your impact on that place. And that was my first experience of natural building, and it was, it's still core. And I think it's something that we really lack when you're trying to make decisions about your impact in the world as a human. It's really hard to make decisions because the supply chains and your work. Okay, so you go and buy a piece of sheetrock to hang on a 2x4 wall, try to figure out all the impacts of that, like how that got to you, and how you can make right decisions, how your actions can make informed impacts on the biosphere where we get materials from, is nearly impossible in a global economy. And it's getting easier because now we have these documents that people are becoming more common, like life cycle analysis documents and environmental product declarations and all that, but it's still pretty arcane. Like most people, that's not what most people are doing when they build, but you get to see that. You get direct feedback from the biosphere, when you go build with extremely local materials. You decide where the holes get dug and which trees come down. And that, I think, is part of what we need to scale. And I realized a few years ago, so this bit of my talk is going to be a little bit focused on carbon and climate change specifically, because it's the lens I've been using. But I realized a little while back that one way to scale that understanding is thinking about our collective relationship to mostly bioregional supply chains. So if you want to continue the next slide. So what do I mean by that? Yeah.
I just want to highlight the thing that you said, because I think it's powerful and important. So that you're talking about the part to scale up is people's experience of the effect their building materials and the building of the space has on the land it comes from, and that you're saying there is a way to scale up that piece.
Yeah, so I guess going back to how I said it maybe earlier in the presentation, there's, it is our birthright to be a positive impact on nature, but it's also our responsibility to understand how to do that. And so it's hard coming to understand how to do that requires a direct and more informed relationship with the parts of the landscape where you're using things from, and what that means, if that's a clearer way to say what I just said. Okay, cool. So what I mean by materials and supply chains, for this context, I find it useful to break building materials down into two basic categories, and one I call, quote, mineral-based. This is not, as far as I know, formal terminology. I made it up. But mineral-based materials get dug out of the ground. They tend to be made, it's gravel, metal, aggregate, greater or lesser degrees of impact, but they're basically inert. Once they're not part of a dynamic, growing process. And so of course we use some of those in natural building, and obviously in hybrid buildings we use a lot of them. And then on the other hand, you have ecosystem-based materials, like all the plants, and we use a lot of plants, most commonly straw and wood, but a lot of other things, some bamboo and hemp increasingly. And what's interesting about those materials, if you want to continue, is that they are pretty high leverage when it comes to making choices, having an impact collectively. And this again is looking at carbon emissions specifically, just because it's been talking about materials and carbon is a pretty good way to reach beyond the boundaries of the people who already are engaged in natural building work. So other designers or funders for research or whatever. And it's also obviously important. I don't think it captures all the metrics of resilience, but it's a good lens. So actually don't go yet. Back one slide. There we go. So if you look at this, if you're just using the lens of carbon emissions, it's, depending on which part of the world you're looking at, it's close to a quarter of our emissions come from different types of land use. So things that are involved with ecosystem-based supply chains. And that's the green band there in this particular graph. Okay. And so I'm going to zoom in on straw for a minute and just talk a little bit about what that means. So at this point, you've probably heard that straw as a building material sequesters carbon. What does that mean? Just so you know, there's a discussion around the difference between sequestering and storing, which I'm not going to get into today. But the way a grass works, or of any type of plants really, but grasses are particularly quick at it. Straw comes from cereal grasses. Grasses absorb carbon dioxide and sunlight and create sugar, and they build their bodies with that process, but they also create more sugar than is needed for the plant itself. And so the upper part of a grass plant that's straw producing is the seed and the straw that we build with. And that straw is made largely of carbon that used to be carbon dioxide. So the plant explicitly removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and turns it into a solid material. That as soon as straw breaks down, that carbon returns to the atmosphere. But if you take that straw and you put it in the wall of a building where the whole point is for it not to break down, then you've created a carbon sink. You've not permanently, because eventually the building will break down, but for a longer period of time, you've removed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and produced something useful out of it. In addition, grasses also, so I mentioned that grasses make more sugar than they need for their immediate growth purposes. And so kind of recently, we've learned that what happens to those sugars is that the plant sends them down into the ground and feeds what is called the soil microbiome with them, which is this big, it's basically an old growth forest underground, if you're talking about undisturbed soil or well-protected soil of bacteria and all sorts of small creatures and fungi that facilitate, that have a very complex ecosystem below the ground and also facilitate water and nutrient uptake for above ground plants. And they will take those sugars and convert them to carbon in the soil. And so when you are treating a grassland properly or a cropland, then those plants are naturally taking carbon out of the atmosphere and returning it into the soil where we need it in the first place. One of the regenerative agriculture people that I've worked with says that even if we weren't dealing with climate change, one of the great projects of the 21st century would be to recarbonize the world's agricultural soils. So then you can thinking about a supply chain for straw, so what goes into making straw that we build with? Right now, it usually comes from what is mostly called industrial agriculture, where you're growing a lot of one crop. The soil stays bare for long periods in between crops. There's a lot of tilling. There's a lot of fertilizer. All of those activities suppress the soil microbiome and actually release carbon. But we also have the ability to design a straw supply chain that looks like this, where you have a biodiversity of crops, which gives you a better below ground biodiversity, because different plants like to have different, they have particularly good relationships with different parts of the soil microbiome. And you sequester carbon in both places. The straw becomes one crop that gets used to build a building, and that carbon doesn't go back into the atmosphere, and the whole ecosystem is producing many things. I'm not going into this in much detail in this presentation because it's a sort of a bigger picture presentation, but you can design these croplands to be producing multiple products, not just straw, and become more stable and more nutrients rich and better at retaining water over time. You know, and if we make a choice for a building to be derived from this cropland, then the building is suddenly having these impacts all the way up the supply chain and creating resilience in these multiple directions that you simply just don't get with other forms of agriculture. And so we begin to have the same type of landscape choices, except scaled up. And so this is, you know, if you're thinking about ecosystems of resilience developing, you know, what I just described is really just bringing together the disciplines of what I'm calling regenerative building, natural building obviously being a big contributor to that, and regenerative agriculture, straw being the link between those two. I mean, obviously other things too, but straw is probably the most obvious link at this time. And you can see this whole network of benefits that are created by that relationship in human practices that has impacts everywhere. In human, you know, and also bioregional supply chains is not something I'm so much focused on right now, but the scale of a supply chain matters, you know, and so you can have relationships with smaller farmers who are paying more attention to the biodiversity of their crops, and you can build up localized, I mean, you know, whole state of California size markets for regeneratively produced building materials. And I actually forgot why I put this slide in there. So this is just another way to conceptualize how you begin to think when you begin to think outward into the landscape, and how other practices can co-evolve with production of building materials, and the production, and how we make our built environment, even if and I think what's been really fun about trying to work out this narrative is that I have given presentations on this a few times to urban people, and what's so exciting is they're like, oh my God, we have a built environment that we could use to support the creation of these ecosystems outside the urban fabric, you know. And so suddenly the scale works out, so that if you have a bioregional supply chain that the city is looking at supporting and using and helping to store carbon in, then it empowers everybody in the city. So that's, I think, been really exciting to start having that conversation. And of course, California is a fun place to do that. So really, just to conclude, this is, when you're just thinking about biosphere, the relationship between the biosphere and the built environment, this is what I would call business as usual. You know, they're two separate things. We don't think of them as related. The biosphere contributes a lot of materials to the built environment. The built environment also requires a lot of money. And by and large, it gives us housing and other good things, obviously. But what it gives back to the biosphere is waste, carbon dioxide, and various types of physical waste and toxins that the biosphere has to somehow absorb. But what we can make, and natural building is a huge piece of this, is this scenario where the built environment is a part of the biosphere. When you invest money in regenerative building, that money literally gets reinvested into the biosphere. Waste and materials become the same thing, and carbon dioxide is sequestered everywhere. And with that, I will turn it back over to the moderators.
How exciting. I had this playful thought. There's so much there, but it, you know, considering how popular the farm to table movement has been, this is like the farm to porch movement, farm to wall.
We were calling
movement.
it farm to shelter. Somebody
yeah,
suggested
the farm to shelter. And I feel like, you know, amongst the many thoughts I have, it gives people an in to engage. And I would argue that there is a multitude of human beings on the planet right now who are eager for a way that they can bring the culture shifting, the future resilience into the life that they need to live pragmatically, into
Yeah.
their very walls. And this
Mhm.
is a means to do that I could see. I mean, it's just beautiful, brilliant, and destined to be successful.
Oh, cool. I hope so. There's so much work to do. Oh my God.
Hmm.
Yes, indeed. 7,000 course corrections between here and the moon, and probably almost as far between where we are and where we want to be as a culture. So, but that doesn't mean we don't start moving that direction immediately and helping in whatever way we can. Yeah, so I just wanted to pose this question as well. Like, to me, one of the most magical things about the relationships we build on site is how do we extend those out to the community that we interact with, all the straw farmers that I got to know over the years, and all the suppliers and supply chains, and have really found welcome in the conventional building world as well, looking, developing relationships with clay manufacturers, clay building material manufacturers and things like that. Has been as rewarding, and maybe even more so than digging up my own clay. But there is that sense of the quality of the community that's hard to grow beyond. Have you guys had much experience with that, overcoming that challenge of maintaining the quality and energy that we have in kind of the small scale natural building at the end of a dirt road, or on an island for you, Molly, that's, your supply chains are even more always in your present experience there as well, huh?
My experience, and I think this is where maybe there is a hole in the system, is that any time the supply chain isn't local or sort of through people or connections like that, seems to be something lost. And I can't quite put my finger on exactly what that quality is that gets lost, but I guess I could say that it's just the connection to the materials, because so much of what we do, even if it is like an engineered home, we're still sourcing as much of the materials as possible, whether the engineer allowed us to go collect some logs off the beach, that's kind of an unusual thing, but it did happen, and that really made that building that much more precious than say if it had just been stuff from the lumber store, So yeah, I'm not quite sure how to sort of. One of the other things too is that we don't grow a lot of straw in the southwest coast of British Columbia, so straw is always kind of something that we're reaching for, and it would be nice if that could change. That would be a good thing.
Thanks, Molly. How about you, Chris? You've built probably a pretty extensive community around your project up there, huh?
Yeah, I think, it's David Eisenberg who talks a lot about the sort of feedback loops, and to me that's kind of the essential part of those supply chain connections, is that the closer they are to you, the tighter the feedback loop. If my building literally required a clear cut that I can see from my house, I might not feel so, I would feel very differently about that than, that same lumber being clear cut where I don't see it. And so, local, I don't feel, I work with a lot of manufactured materials, but I work with a lot of materials that are manufactured locally by local people. I'm happy to use 2x4s that are cut at one of we've probably got a dozen, maybe 14 small sawmill operations very close to where I live. And they're all square, and they're all, they have that sort of mechanical, they came out of machines, but they came out of machines from people who I know personally, and I know, you know, how they treat the other people that work there. And I feel like there's a, you know, that it's not necessarily the, you know, the physical properties of the material that make it great. Sometimes it is the fact that I know the human being connected to that thing. And, you know, I think that what Massey's talking about, those connections, we can the material doesn't have to necessarily be so raw and literally, you know, done with my own hands. If you know, we keep talking about human connections, like if there is that human connection to the person with the machine who, you know, did the thing, and I went there and saw it and got it and brought it back, I think that tightening is really great. And there's a lot that we can do even in the conventional world to make the things that we now sort of outsource to somewhere we don't have no idea where it is, to bring that stuff closer to home. There's so much great stuff that can happen there. I think, you know, that the notion of what's going on between the sort of the urban rural split that's happening, you know, in my country, and I think in the US as well, there's a lot that could be healed there if the people in the rural economies felt like they were being supported by the people in the urban economies. And one of the great ways that the people in the urban economy can do that is to invest in your local rural area. To, you know, if you're a builder, buy from a local sawmill. If you're a straw bale builder, buy from a local farm. If you know, whatever it is you happen to be doing, if that investment is going into your sort of local rural economy, you can have all kinds of other conversations. You know, I might not talk climate change with farmers that much, but I can have that conversation a lot more easily if I'm also buying their straw at the same time, and if I've offered them $1 a bale more than they're used to getting, and saying, like, I really appreciate what you're doing, I'd like to pay you more than what you're asking for this thing you're doing. Then we start having a conversation, and climate change does come up. Or, you know, we start talking about no-till agriculture, and I start learning about why they might be hesitant to try that, or, you know, what they tried and did and didn't work, you know, but I have to know that person to have that conversation. And one of the ways I can have that conversation is to bring them my business. and then suddenly you're talking about stuff in a really meaningful way.
Beautiful. Yeah, lots to be said there. I think, especially if we have time to return back to the qualitative experience and what happens when you do harvest your own materials as a team, and how to help build that qualitatively into the supply chain loops, or whether it is actually an impossibility to bring that quality to the supply chain loops once you separate from that experience and the direct site. But with an eye to time, maybe we should move to Chris's presentation and loop back on these other topics. Thanks again, Massey, and all of you for the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Massey. That was great. Thanks for being the climate change nerd.
No, you're the climate change nerd now, dude.
I know, but you are. I don't have to do.
Oh, just tonight. No.
Anyway, I think I am going to sort of overlap, well, obviously with what both Molly and Massey have talked about tonight. But on my way here tonight, thinking about where this conversation might go, I was actually listening to a podcast. It wasn't a permaculture podcast, but in the podcast, the person sort of brought up the permaculture notion of edges, and, you know, how interesting, you know, how those are the richest places where things kind of intersect, where one system meets another system. And so, you know, a lot of times we want to see that in a really simple way, like, you know, oh, here we have what's good for the climate, and here we have building, and there's a place where those two things meet, and that's great. If you can make a building that's, you know, good for a person and good for the climate, awesome, that edge is great. But the picture on the right, like, that's that's the Venn diagram, you know, that I think at heart natural building, or how I see it, is trying to make a building that is at the middle of that complex lot of overlapping circles. And I think we've already touched on that tonight, that, you know, it's about children and parents and people and supply chains and money and, you know, climate change and all of these things. And so, you know, I'm really interested in where is the place where the most of those things overlap. And that's sort of my natural building practice tries to be in that spot. So you can skip on. But yeah, I would really like to, I guess, you know, restate in a lot of ways what's already been said, and that is that the human connection, and you can find this human connection anywhere that people get together and do work together, but buildings require a lot of work, and so it's a great place for this to happen, and it's a great place for those kinds of exchanges, and I really appreciate it. I've never really thought about it in terms of the words you use, Molly, but help, like that, all that happens on a job site is people help each other. Like nothing goes forward, and that can be everything from very explicit help, like, hey, can you help me pick this up, to the help that, like, an architect who you might not even see on the site has lent to the job because they've helped you, you know, figure out how big things need to be and what that connection needs to look like. And, you know, so all the way through from the very sort of, you know, earliest parts of the design phase to the, you know, final putting things together on site, you know, it is an entire, it's only about help, you know, everybody involved in this project is helping to get it to an end place. And I think we don't have very many places where that happens anymore. I think, you know, when our societies were more rural and were more agriculture based, there was a lot more opportunity. A lot of people worked together on farms, and so these chances to work on buildings are, you know, one of the few times where you do get to be in that environment of help, and you get to do it in you know, the case of natural building, it tends to bring really interesting communities of people together. But anyway, my point here is that with natural building, we tend to really identify natural building with materials. You know, I use clay, therefore I'm a natural builder. I use straw, therefore I'm a natural builder. I do, you know, whatever the material happens to be. But those materials are just stuff, and the stuff would just sit in piles being stuff if, you know, people weren't involved all the way through, from, you know, whether I'm harvesting it or somebody else is harvesting it, you know, the whole way along that supply chain that Massey described. That's only people, you know, in that supply chain. And so I think thinking about being a natural builder to me is thinking about the fact that all I'm doing is making connections with and to other people along that path. And I also really loved what Molly said about the, you know, the building stays here and the relationships, you know, move. And that's, you know, that's really been, those are great words to describe something I've felt for a long time. And you described it really well. But, you know, my connection to everybody in these photos and to hundreds of other people keeps going. So a lot of what I've done in my career is try to figure out how to keep the people part of natural building, how to keep the focus on healthy materials, local materials, supply chains, all the stuff that we've talked about today, and also do it quicker, better, faster, easier, cheaper, because that matters for so many reasons. And so, you know, to me, this is one of those really interesting permaculture type edges where, you know, we're finding the place where these really great materials that we're getting from really great sources, and then we're putting together these teams of people, and then we're figuring out, okay, so the industrialized version of building has done a lot of crappy things, but it also does allow us to do things quickly, easily, and more affordably. And so how do we bring those things together? And so you know, we've done a lot of work with trying to basically prefabricate systems that that use all of these materials. And when we were talking earlier about the sort of how do you do this kind of stuff in a more urban context? Well, you might not be able to have a bale raising, you know, on a 36 by 70 foot lot because you can't even park that many straw bales there in the first place. And if you do, there's no room for the house. But, you know, we can sure make those walls just outside the city or, you know, somewhere nearby and move them there and stand them up. And it's made of all the same stuff, and it's been done in the same way with the same care. So yeah, this is one of those edges. And I think that this makes things resilient in a lot of ways. It makes natural building something that a group of people can actually make a living doing in one place. You know, I spent the first 15 years of my career being a ridiculous road warrior type builder because the only way I could make a living was to take any job I could find where somebody was building one of these, you know, houses out in the woods somewhere, and run around like crazy and drive all the time and go to sites, you know, all over Ontario. And, you know, part of the drive to do something like what's in these photos is I want to work in one place. I want to be able to walk to that workplace. I want the workplace to be something that functions year round. I want it to be, you know, dry and warm and comfortable for me and the people who work there all the time. And so, you know, yeah, this is one of those edges, and it like all edges, it causes friction because it's not what people necessarily in the natural building world identify with, and it's not what people in the conventional world identify with. And so, but it's great. It's kind of like, you know, meshing these things together. So that's, and I think, you know, resilience comes out of those edges. Like, I think, so anyway, yeah. So here is another sort of, I guess, edge that we've touched on already, but one of the things that we do with our classes and our clients is the team goes and at least meets the people who are harvesting the materials and ideally works with them, so that, not that we're trying to, builders don't need to know how to be farmers and foresters, but if the builder knows the farmer and knows the forester and at least understands, like, how much work is it to take a log out of a forest, and what thought goes into that, and what work goes into that, and, you know, what level of skill and knowledge and understanding goes into that, you really appreciate that log or that bale or that, you know, clay brick or, you know, whatever it happens to be. And so I think that's another edge that I'm really interested in trying to grow, is that notion that you know, we overlap with these people because we work with the materials that they make, they produce, they harvest, they grow. And so developing that is some, you know, developing that relationship in that meeting place is really important. Okay. So here's a place that I love these days is, and there's a lot of intersections, you know, in this one sort of group of photos. This is biology meeting chemistry, meeting climate research, meeting builders and buildings. So this is us making a prefab straw bale wall panel, but we're making it with mycofoam insulation that we're growing in situ right on top of the straw bale. And we're doing it because, you know, the straw and the mycelium and, you know, all the materials in this panel have stored carbon, and you know, are healthy. And again, just, you know, there are so many intersections here. And even though it looks like a funny white rectangle when it's done, you know, it's this really amazing, you know, coming together of, you know, the folks at Ecovative who figured out this particular strain of mushrooms that grows all this mycelium and no fruit, or no fruit for a long time. And yeah, it's the sort of excitement to me of the how all of these things are starting to overlap, where climate researchers are realizing that, oh, the built environment has all this potential to be a massive carbon sink, and we can get good materials from farms and forests, but we could also grow it ourselves in situ. And, you know, looking at a company like Biomason that's growing bricks and growing tiles by feeding microbes in a bed of sand, and they suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere and poop it back out, and it glues the sand together. It's like a, you know, all of this stuff is so interesting, and not maybe what natural building has identified with up until now. But, you know, it's hard to imagine a more natural building material than a mycelium insulation, and you grow it right in place. So anyway, another great sort of series of edges. But again, to the greater point of resilience, I think, you know, you get a lot of resilience out of all of these intersections. You know, when I, as the builder, don't have to know everything about the climate and know everything about biology and know everything about chemistry, but the people who know about those things need to know what we need in order to make this a viable building product. You know, that all those intersections make the whole, all of that research and all of that work so much more resilient. Okay, so I think this is my last slide, and this, you're right, Massey, I couldn't avoid but being the climate nerd here. But so I do nerd out on these numbers a lot, and I did a study last year on what is the carbon footprint of, you know, building the way we do it now and building the way we could do it, as sort of Molly and Massey have been describing. And, you know, this is the end of a pretty long study, so you're getting the 1-page synopsis here. But essentially, you know, if in the US, the average residential building has about 225 kilograms of CO2 emissions for every square meter of building area. So in a typical year in the US, that's 54 million tons of carbon emissions come from just making the materials that go into conventional buildings. So 54 million tons is about what 15 coal-fired power plants would put out in a year. So it's big, you know, and you know, that the climate lens that Massey was talking about. Well, you can go to the next part, Tim. But one of the things that's really interesting to me about the climate lens, maybe I'll talk about this first though. So a lot of the buildings that we build, and, you know, people in the natural building world build, have net carbon storage for the reasons that Massey talked about, that the plant-based building materials, the podcast I was listening to today was about people inventing the machines that pull carbon dioxide out of the air and turn it into carbon. And, you know, all the wonderful research that's going on and how amazing these machines are. It's like, those machines are plants, and we have a lot of them on the planet, and they're already sucking the CO2 out of the atmosphere. And if we could get this, and this is just residential building, small scale residential building, like low rise, if we could get people in the building industry to stop doing this carbon emitting building thing and build not necessarily full on natural buildings, but, you know, ones like that Massey showed, you know, maybe it has metal siding, maybe it still has a concrete foundation, but it's got a lot of plants in it. that way of building, you know, you can store pretty reliably about 150 kilograms of CO2 in a square meter of that kind of building. And so like a full-on transition from business as usual to that kind of building, first of all, stops those 15 coal plants worth of emissions from happening every year. And then additionally, suck up the equivalent of 10 coal plants worth of emissions. And so residential building built with the kinds of materials we're talking about here tonight per year could make a 25 coal plant a year difference in the climate annually. And it's, you know, that to me is, it's really exciting that like the things that we've all been working with, these sticks and straws and dirt clods and you know, this really basic stuff, can sort of speak to climate healing in such a major way. And then I think if you click, Tim, yeah, like, and that for me, what's been really interesting is that in the very sort of complicated overlapping Venn diagram that has so many little circles coming together, like those words that I've put there, but so many more too, that what I've been finding really fascinating is that the climate is the thing that's located at the middle of all of those intersections. That in general, if I can build a building that is the best building I can build for climate healing, then it also tends to overlap with all of these other things, like not necessarily. So like, so there's no kind of like smugness about it, and there's no certainty that just by building a carbon storing building, you're going to hit the middle of that diagram. But you're certainly already aimed towards the middle of that diagram, and it doesn't take a whole lot of, you know, you don't have to be, no, I don't want to say it that way. Anyway, you're at least aimed into the middle of that diagram, where, you know, those materials, they are healthier for people. They do tend to come from local sources. They are biodegradable. Like all of that stuff is kind of more inherent to carbon positive materials than to their kind of conventional counterparts. And, you know, I think we have to make sure that, you know, if we're going to be pushing for this kind of building as a climate solution, that we bring all of the other circles that might not be included into the conversation. Because right now, it's really weird. I mean, the natural builders, who are a small group of people who have largely, you know, have either positioned themselves as outsiders or as seen as outsiders, are suddenly the knowledge holders for this incredible climate action potential. And we're being listened to in a way that I've never been listened to before, because people are caring about the climate. And so I think part of you know, what I'm feeling responsible for as a natural builder knowledge holder, and therefore potentially a climate, you know, solution knowledge holder, is that we make sure that we bring all these other circles in, that you don't, at the end of my master's thesis presentation, one of my very smart thesis supervisors asked me the question. She said, "That was great. This is really great stuff. And now what I want you to tell me is, how could this all go wrong? Because you've told me about how it could all go right." And it was the best question I've ever received. I love her for it. But it struck me at the moment that what could go wrong is that we get so focused on the climate piece that, you know, companies who currently make styrofoam, say, insulation, realize that they could make their carbon numbers look great if they just chop some straw into their styrofoam, and they could make a carbon neutral styrofoam by making a weird straw petrochemical hybrid material. And so like, we can't just have the climate lens, because if you just have the climate lens, that kind of crap can happen. But if you have the climate lens that's already tends towards all of these other things, and then we bring these other things intentionally into the conversation and into our practice, then, you know, we end up as close to the middle of that messy bunch of circles as we can get. And, you know, that's where the good stuff is. Okay, yeah, last slide. Moving big, heavy prefabricated things without cranes. People have moved big, heavy things without cranes for a long time, you know, and it just takes a bunch of people and some rollers and a bit of teamwork. But yeah, I think, you know, this to me is, those are largely plywood and wood boxes full of machine-made cellulose insulation. They're just, yeah, big rectangular floor panel boxes. But that team is a team of natural builders, and they had the same natural building high moment moving these big boxes and getting them into place as they would have if they had, you know, cut the tree down themselves and, you know, hauled it and barked it. And so, you know, I think, and all of those things are good. I mean, I love barking a tree, and I think it's important to do that too. But I think it is really about people in the end, and not about materials. And so, if a natural building crew, oh, there it is, people, is making, you know, boxes full of carbon storing, non-toxic, good stuff, that's also, to me, natural building. And yeah, and it is really about all of those people and what they bring and what they go with.
Thank you so much, Chris. That's, yeah, all of you guys, so inspiring. Thank you again for folding this all the way out. And yeah, I mean, I do think, you know, there's so much that we can do and so much successes we have in natural building, and opportunities to really share those wins we've gathered along the way. And I am just reminded over and over again, especially now, that one of the wins we haven't accomplished is enough of the kind of cultural diversity in our projects that we would hope for. And I wonder, you know, sometimes that question to me stems back to how so much of our buildings were built by volunteers and or workshops, and what a privilege it is to be able to have the time to volunteer or to afford a workshop, and how that ends up kind of isolating those that don't otherwise have that opportunity. So to me, that's been a big piece for me when I've done apprenticeships. I want to make sure they're paying. I want to make sure that I invite the kind of abundance of the economy into the conversation, so that we are taking account of all of the investments and taking account for and offering to people that need to earn a living through their labor an opportunity to encounter and to work with these materials. So that's this final question I have for us all, is how do we propagate that engagement? How do we grow these qualities of community building, of helping, of working hard, of co-creating a space that serves the soul? How do we propagate that for the rest of the world? No, it's an easy one, so just jump in whenever you're ready.
One thing that I was thinking of as Chris was talking was that, like, the Mud Girls is this non-hierarchical, consensus-based collective that has all this guiding principles and things that guide us. And that's often tends to be one of the biggest takeaways after coming to one of our workshops is our unconventional way of running a business, even though it's not really a business, but earning money. And I don't think, and what I try to enforce with the people that we're working with is that not everyone, like we said, is going to turn into a natural builder. But why can't there be collectives of hairdressers? Why can't there be collectives of bootmakers, collectives of booksellers? I mean, there doesn't have to fit into one particular framework. And I think there's lots of room for collaborations once you have something as sort of loose and flexible as a collective, because it's just an agreement that we've all made, and we can keep changing that agreement as things change. And I think there's a true resilience with this ability to be like, well, we're all equal members here, and this part of it isn't working, so let's adjust that part that's not working so that it fits better into this ever-changing world. Yeah.
I think the thing that came into my mind when you asked the question, Tim, was kind of a specific example that's arising right now in the East Bay. There's a conversation going on in one of the nonprofits that I work with for looking at ADUs, so second units, because they've changed the laws for those in California recently to make them a lot easier to build. And how do you employ the ADU as a tool to retain wealth in communities? And looking at a bunch of different use studies, but linking that also to very localized workforce development. Also as a way to retain, because a lot of, big problem in California is gentrification. But also there are communities that need more wealth brought into them in some form, and they need to keep having the wealth taken out. A lot of communities, but certainly urban communities, and so suddenly I'm seeing a place to have, the what I still consider to be the core world of natural building, that I feel like Molly is holding down, brought into Oakland. And it's hard to do. Like, it is hard to do when you suddenly get tangled up with liability and licenses. And I mean, it's like in California, it's intense that way. And so it takes a while. But I'm beginning to see the, because all of these are like 5 or 6 forces that are all coming together right now: workforce development, localization, climate change, probably all sorts of things I can't forecast around what's happening now. And then things like the ADU change in legislation, and the willingness of local, the city of Oakland and other places being willing to write local code to support, people to be able to build a carbon sequestering ADU, with a neighborhood workforce, and so it's like, it's kind of the sea change that Chris is talking about. It's almost like, it's been wild, like watching the conversation change, because I feel like I began to get into more of the national conversation just a little bit before it really began to take this different turn. And it was climate change that did it, because people began to realize that materials do matter when you're doing climate calculations. And then suddenly everybody's like, oh, well, plant-based materials are like really different, And it was this, like, I felt like in the space of a year or 6 months, I went from feeling like I was sort of pushing a boulder uphill to chasing a boulder downhill, and like not being able to keep up with making the content detailed enough or technical or whatever. And then kind of culminated in getting the conference that happened in Oakland last fall that Chris and I both presented at. And it called the Getting to Zero Conference. This is a big conference around just like getting to true zero in the built environment. So, operational emissions and materials, and we were offering the workshop on embodied carbon, and it was all the hippies, except we were the front of the room, and it was everybody in suits, and it was, and literally looking at all of us except maybe Bruce King, we were all like, oh man, we didn't wear the right clothes, except we were the ones talking, so maybe they were all wearing the wrong clothes, I don't know. but it's such an exemplification of like how quickly the conversations turned around. And that was just the beginning. I mean, now what's happening, like we're coming out of this with a different context for everything, I think. And so I don't even know that it's what we have to do. I think it's just time for us to be heard, you know, and looking at being real clear about how that can be applied in our specific contexts, I think.
I think, you know, it is interesting that I was there with you at that conference, and it has been happening a lot. I mean, I'm in places and talking to people who 2 years ago I never would have imagined I would be talking to, and constantly shocked that I'm being taken seriously. And
right?
You know, it is the climate piece that has sort of opened those doors, that you know, suddenly the kooky natural builders are literally the knowledge holders of how to make buildings that reverse climate change. And so, you know, to me, it's like, oh, now there's this opportunity. If a change starts happening in that way, and that was all my stuff about all those overlapping circles, it's like, because those supply chains don't exist right now, because nobody's been trained to build this way, because the codes haven't yet been written, it's sort of like this really interesting, not blank slate, but we can train different people, you know, than the people who've normally been in the construction world. We can open new supply chains because they aren't there and they need to be open. Like it's sort of there's a lot of potential right now to kind of try to land in the middle of that crazy Venn diagram intentionally, because we're nowhere on it right now. And so, you know, if people are looking to us to point the place, then we can just point right to the middle and say, well, like, here, you know, this is how you do it, and bring all of that stuff along. And you know, it's super exciting. And I think, you know, one of the things that people who've been doing natural building for a long time, I mean, we can do that because we learned those materials, but, you know, we also know our codes better than anybody else because we've had to, you know, fight to get things permitted, and we know our insurance because we've had to like fight to get insurance, and we, you know, like we don't have to just guess at what all those other parts of the Venn diagram are. Like we've really had to figure it out, and so we are really good at this stuff in more ways than just the, like, you know, smear some mud on some straw, which is actually the really easy part. But you know, there's a community with a lot of experience in all the other parts that is now, I think, what's going to start to, you know, enable us to be in that position of really, you know, helping to steer a lot more people in a good direction.
Yeah, and I wanted to reinforce something you said too, which is that, yeah, climate change it should be understood as a gateway drug. You know, it's the way to get people to start thinking like an ecosystem. You know, but what I'm excited, it's pretty important to make sure we don't stop there. And I think that's probably why I'm fascinated by supply chains, because I think it requires you to move further in that direction. And also, you know, some of what has the conversations we've been in recently, you know, if people are aware of Project Drawdown, you know, looking at places where you can take climate action, but the book Drawdown does a great job of explaining and really helping to forefront the idea of a co-benefit, which is kind of a technical term for good things that you didn't expect to happen when you did this other thing, you know. And your last slide really captures that well. And it's when you're working in in an ecological mode, you often know that that's happening because you do one thing and you accomplish 4 other things that you weren't necessarily focused on. And that's not, as you said, it's not a given. But when the more that we learn to do that, the more that we're going to be able to address multiple challenges at the same time, you know. And that's, I think, really the power of these practices, and also how that principle expands out into things that aren't like, quote, you know, natural building. So I think it's really important to just reinforce that point that you made.
I have a question sort of towards that, and Chris, it had to do with the portion of your presentation where your teacher asked that question of what can go wrong, and you gave that great example of, well, here, you know, we see there's examples of how it could go wrong, and it feels like what you're describing is that, in a way, the natural building movement has been given the stage at this moment, and it seems like there's a challenge / opportunity to really direct the path of it so that those important points on the diagram that haven't fit with ease into capitalism, which is what, you know, could go wrong, right? Is that this natural building just follows into the same sort of structural traps of capitalism. I guess a question is, have you found places with the attention that you're receiving and the respect that you're receiving right now, when you've been able to assert qualities of like what also needs to be carried forward, what also needs to be considered as instead of just climate change, you know, people's quality of lives, kids, like the other things that, you know, the relationships, as we've kind of highlighted throughout this conversation, we feel like is essential to that true resilience. So I guess, have you had opportunities to affirm that as a necessity? And if you haven't, what do you think it would take? And just kind of curiosity around how to make sure that that happens. How, like, if there is a tide change, like what kind of extra force do we need to give in this moment so that we ensure that's carried through? It's a question.
Well, I'm pretty sure that I don't have nearly as much influence as you might be ascribing here, but I think, you know, what I can do and what I have really been trying to do, and I would really like to tip my hat to my colleague Ace McCarlton in Vermont, who's been a real teacher for me in this way, is to just make sure that I'm never involved in a conversation about this stuff that doesn't include all of those things. You know, I might be invited somewhere to talk carbon numbers, but you can bet that I'm also going to be talking equity and supply chains and, you know, all of those other things, and basically, you know, it's the wrong term, but like selling it as a package. Like, it's not, you know, it's not, there's not a one, you don't get this without getting this, or, you know, that's the way that I would, you know, present it. And that's, you know, that's all I know how to do right now. But I think because, you know, in a lot of ways, the climate movement and social justice movements, they overlap a lot already. Like, it's not, you know, that people are hearing that stuff from a lot of different directions, you know, not just one natural builder who shows up at a conference full of suits. It's, you know, you're hearing it from everybody involved in these discussions. You know, you're hearing it from people who are, you know, deep in the climate movement, but realize that, you know, there is no climate movement if there's not a social justice movement, and vice versa. And so I think, you know, that message is being reinforced constantly. You know, there aren't very many people giving the climate message who aren't giving a broader picture. And so I think it's not just, you know, on the natural builders to do that. I think you know, there are a lot of people doing that very well in all of those movements, like making sure that those movements link.
Beautiful. Well, I think we're at time. I'd love to keep the conversation going, so if you're willing, let's do that.
Okay. All right. So what I was going to say was, so of the things that I had said before when we were talking before was that, well, first off, I want to say that, you know, capitalism is sort of the problem. Like, that's the rot that we're seeing, you know, when COVID hit and the economy starts to fall apart. And then now, you know, we're treated disparities across. The last thing we want to see is building commodified and streamlined and, you know, specialized and have abuses of labor as a result of, you know, your eco-friendly home. So I totally agree with the whole idea that it has to be more than one lens. There is no one lens, because it's all interconnected. And like Chris was saying, also, like the idea, like with the Mud Girls, when we've always presented ourselves as this entire package. You don't just get to do whatever you want because you hired us. Like, we have these guidelines and we send a lot, you know, all these ways in which we work, the things that we can do for you, the things we expect you to do as well. And because we're not contractors, so we have to either find a contractor or be a contractor. And already that they're getting built-in childcare, like they're clients for us. Like, we're not just going to work for anybody. They have to agree with our ideas and our ways of doing things before we're going to move forward with them. And I think that if that idea was present, not gonna, sure, we do minor bodies, like pretending Reebok and Adidas stunts. I mean, it's not like that. I mean, we selectively choose these things, but there's so much more. If we had our values all straightened out, then we would put our money where our mouth is.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an essential piece that we start really modeling. And I think that's one of the great pieces to me and Chris and Massey's work, is because they were doing the modeling and the measuring of all those pieces and publishing it, then it became available to really assess, oh yeah, this is actually a complete solution. And I think the more we can really start, those of us that are so deeply tied to the kind of economic equality and social benefits that come out of natural building, can start articulating how essential those are, not just qualitatively but quantitatively, to the culture we create, then I think that gives another opportunity to enter into that conversation with people like you that are great wisdom holders for them, what it means to have a qualitatively different experience and a culture that creates, and how that culture can be self-propagating and does just have endless abundant ripples.
Hello all. I'm gonna chime in. It's a good thing I'm on mute for most of the time, because I find myself just saying what a treat this has been. My child carriage has turned back into a pumpkin, as I like to say, and I need to go back and take care of my kiddo here as we come to 7:30. I want to just say thank you. I'm going to make sure I put some thoughts down onto paper tonight before I lose them, because this brought up so many valuable paths to explore further. I hope, and maybe this is a gift that Kurt could give us, to provide a link to people's, well, I know we have your bios on our event page, but I know there's going to be a lot of people who would like to get further information. So I just want to plug to make sure that happens. And just to say thank you as I need to head off into hanging out with my kid. Thank you, truly, very much.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Moses.
Till next time.
Until next time. Maybe in person next year. Hey, that would be nice.
Yeah.
I'd vote for that. I would accept that. Good night for now.
Good night,
night.
friends. And
Good
thank-
night.
Yeah, so we did have some other great questions. You know, if there was one single code thing we would change or that we could instigate into our culture, have you thought of one kind of essential seed to plant in the culture at large that could help change things, or one thing you would wish to change about the codes in our cities?
This is already changing, but having them be performance-based changes a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there is a lot of interesting work going on, and I don't think it's actually reflected in codes yet. But you know, at heart, codes are they're documents about risk, and they've done actually a really great job, you know, on the risks that they've been looking at, and those are sizable. Like, you know, people, thousands and thousands of people used to die in fires in cities until there were good fire codes, and you know, things would fall down until, you know, there were codes that stopped things from falling down. And but the risks, you know, our codes are still focused at that level of risk being like to the person in the building or the person right next to the building or to the building itself, and they've sort of drawn that circle around the world, and they've, you know, there are all these external risks that are just like, well, that's not part of the code because we do this. And I think, you know, broadening the notion of what risk is and why building codes need to address climate is because, you know, at this point there's more risk to the person in the building from climate failure than there is from fire, because we've done a really good job at identifying and eliminating these other risks. And I think we need the sort of the codes realm to, you know, champion up the same way they've championed up over all these other risks around things like climate, around things like toxic loading, around, you know, accessibility to housing, like that, for the code world to see themselves as having a central role to play in mitigating those risks as well. And so I don't think it's like there's not one magic, you know, line of code that's going to change that, but I think a willingness by the folks in the codes realm to see themselves as having an active role to play in all of these other sort of collective risks, which requires looking, you know, further than the four walls of the building.
And yeah, and I agree with everything you said. And also conversely, at least in California, some lens for helping the codes become simple to interact with again. Because here, some of, at least in the urban areas, not so much in other parts of California, but that's become a driver that's been driving cost up. Are a lot of people thinking about a lot of different things that are all good to think about, and we need a wider lens, which might or might not add a lot of complexity to physical building practices, might help simplify actually, but that's becoming, like, even the architects that I know who are all pretty talented are just like, man, the code is really getting out of control in California. I mean, it's just, but also there's some really great things happening in it, and it's just it's really a lot to navigate. So I don't know what that looks like, but I think it's something we're going to run up against, especially if we widen our lens, which we need to do.
How about for you up there, Molly?
I have to say, there are no codes. Nobody's really working that hard right now in BC to put natural building into the code. It's just not really my passion to work towards that either. I need to find somebody else who is, but so much of what we do is through using engineers. And we actually really like that because it takes the liability off the councils and puts it on the backs of the engineers. And then you work with these really great engineers who are often quite open-minded, usually if they're taking on a natural building, are quite open-minded and willing to look for an answer to a question. So, you know, I was bringing up the fact that sometimes when we build our little tiny shacks in the woods, we use dry stack stone. And I just brought it up with this engineer and he was like, I wonder how we could get it. You know, he sat there and he thought about it for a minute going, I wonder how we could do that. So yeah, I don't have a specific answer for the codes, but I do see that there are possibilities and ways in which people who are obviously super intrigued in how things can be kept natural and close to the planet and still be functional. And, you know, we live in an earthquake zone like California. So there's just, you can't just build whatever you want, however you want, and have it be safe. So.
Yeah, those are good pieces. I think for me, in all my years of looking at it and also looking at doing development work, you know, building 200 natural building homes and what it would take to do that, or, you know, 94% of the construction in the United States is developer built, you know, so even if all of the custom homes went natural, you still have such a little impact. So for me, it really, the closest thing to a linchpin in the whole catastrophic funding of buildings and how they get built is the appraisal process, because that determines what a building is worth and what a bank's willing to loan on it. And I think if jurisdictions were to change the requirement that a building be appraised for its true life cycle cost, for its true life cycle assessment, for its impact throughout its whole, you know, course of existence, that could actually completely change the assessment of buildings on a cost per square foot to a cost per function, which is how we can actually vastly minimize what gets built. Because the developer has to maximize, if they're required through their lens, or if they're a corporation, they're legally bound to maximize their profit, which means maximizing the useless square footage in a structure. And I think if we just shift that lens, that to me is the single highest leverage point to shift the lens to a home needs to have a much different function than its cost per square foot. And we have this, not just the cost per value in construction and repair, but the cost per value per function over the life cycle of a building and its health and well-being for the inhabitants, for the people that are going to have to recycle those materials and or remanufacture them, could be a place where we have a lot of chasing the boulder downhill once that question gets really asked and assessed. Well, thank you all so much. This has been a dream and a treat, and for taking up the challenge of trying to make it an ongoing conversation while we presented. I'm really happy to have been a part of it, and maybe we can do it again, as there's going to be no shortage of challenges to address in how we redefine and recreate and co-create this culture together.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks for bringing this all together.
Yeah.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you all here.
Thank you again to everyone that didn't get time to ask a question directly on the sidelines or didn't get to share in the group visual conversation. We see you, we appreciate you. So many great natural builders part of this process, and hopefully you inspired a lot of us to share from our hearts and what the possibilities can be. Until next time, be well all.
Yeah. Good night.
Good night, you guys.